Problems and solutions for bird collisions with students, civic groups, buildings, and architects. We're raising awareness by teaming with local, national, and international groups, and we've made sure that people understand the overwhelming crisis of as many as 1 billion birds a year dying from window collisions in the United States alone. Our 200 volunteers have been on the streets and in the neighborhoods of Chicago for what will be our 17th year, finding and responding to calls regarding thousands of dead and injured birds. We find close to 6,000 a year just in the 1 square mile we survey in downtown Chicago. And we're letting people know that this is a critical and important issue, and not letting the evidence of what is happening to local and visiting birds be swept away and go unnoticed. And you could say that the birds featured tonight were brought to you by the volunteers and many of the members in our audience. I'd like everyone who takes part in CBCM's work to stand up and give yourself a round of applause. Stand up. Let's see who's a CBCM. All right, and a special thanks to Kristen Wacker, who inspired this talk. Kristen Becker, he inspired the talk and helped organize the meet Van Hoot tonight. CBCM wants to be able to sustain and expand our efforts, and we need volunteers and donations to keep our work going. So please check out things over at the table there, take a brochure on volunteering, sign up to hear about more, look at when our training events are going to be for the upcoming spring season, and find a way to help us help more birds. Out there you'll also find information about an important initiative that we've been leading with the Chicago Audubon Society called Bird Friendly Chicago. It's a working group that's developing and promoting a bird-friendly design ordinance in Chicago that will require that developments in our city take bird safety in mind in the way that they build, landscape, and use glass. And we're excited that this ordinance was introduced to City Council last month. It's going to be reviewed by committee in the building department, and we encourage you to contact your city officials and let them know how important this issue is to you, the birds we love, and the environment that we want to keep healthy. And on a federal level, Representative Mike Quigley is championing a federal Bird Safe Buildings Act. It's going to require that all federal construction be bird friendly. So spread the word to friends and relations around the country to get their congressional representatives to support this Illinois initiative that was started by Mike Quigley, who worked with CBCM back when he was Cook County Commissioner, and who put a bird friendly requirement for Cook County construction years ago. So hopefully we'll have things happening on a national level. Last but not least, I want to thank the representatives of the Field Museum who are here tonight. Without their willingness to take tens of thousands of dead birds that CBCM volunteers recover, we wouldn't have the expert documentation and use of these unfortunate collision victims. Would everyone who helps us at the Field Museum please stand up? I want to see who's here from the field. These people have lost their sense of smell for science in order to be able to handle those specimens. So thanks to them. Other cities don't have such an opportunity to save all these birds and make use of them. Which brings us to tonight's speaker, who is Ben Winger, Assistant Professor for the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and the Museum of Zoology at the University of Michigan, former associate at the Field Museum, who's been able to use the extensive number of birds we collect for the important research that's telling us more about these birds' natural history, their evolutionary path, and the environment we live in. And as was pointed out to me, he is also proof that people do gravitate toward their name designations. Nominative determinism is the phrase that I learned, or Dickensian naming. Who better to study birds than someone named Ben Winger? And who do you need to rescue a bird? Annette Prince. And few people know that Dave Willard has changed his name from what was either Dave Willett or Dave Mallard. Not sure, but it seems to be the trend here, so everything is appropriate that way. So we're very excited to have Ben's presentation. I want to let you know that we're trying to schedule another talk on April 16th with a graduate student, Heather Skeen, from the University of Chicago, who is also using CBCM specimens for her research, and she wants to give a presentation, and we would welcome folks coming to hear what she has found from the specimens that she's studying from collections at the field. So stay tuned for details about that. Go to our webpage, birdmonitors.net, and please welcome, without further ado, Dr. Ben Winger.
Annette for that intro, and to Annette and Kristen for inviting me here. This is really fun. Before I, all right, that works. So, actually, we better fix that. Yeah, if you don't mind, I can get started as well. So before I go any further, I want to do acknowledgments beforehand. So the work I'm going to be presenting today to say that it would be not be possible without Dave Willard would be a bit of an understatement.
We're trying to
As
tip it down.
I'm using data that he's been collecting for a long time, along with Mary Hennon at the Field Museum, and in addition to collecting the data, they've also both been putting in a lot of work lately to summarize it and give it to us in Michigan to work on. So, in addition, Brian Weeks, Dr. Brian Weeks, a postdoc in
It's coming out where I need to. There we go. There we go. That's correct. Too low. Go. Coming a little higher. Coming back up. Here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a picture on.
Well, this.
So, Brian's back. All right. Brian is a postdoc in my research group at Michigan who's done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of statistical analyses and also writing papers that are going to come out of this work. And so actually this is a bit of a sneak preview in the sense that all the work that I'll be talking about tonight is almost published, not published yet, but it's been sent out to peer review, which in the scientific literature is an important process of getting things published. So we're almost there. And I'm excited to share this sort of sneak preview with all of you because for the CBCM volunteers, if you've ever monitored a building or found a dead bird and brought it to the Field Museum, you have contributed directly to this research. And in fact, for those of you who also look at live birds and keep track of them, if you have ever submitted an eBird checklist in the city of Chicago, this you've also contributed to what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so before I get into that, I think we should just have a brief overview of why birds hit buildings. And of course, we can see them smacking the glass. We know that reflective glass is a huge problem, especially, well, anywhere actually. In the sort of almost 1 billion birds that die supposedly in the United States from collisions. Most of them are actually in rural areas. It's just the aggregate of suburbs and all the homes that are out there that are producing these really high numbers. But we see the densities in large cities. And in these large cities, the real problem, of course, is this artificial light at night that is attracting birds that are migrating at night into unnatural areas. It's drawing them out of the sky, and then either they collide with buildings or other structures right away, or they're just trapped there so that the next day they'll be flying around the loop or wherever and are disoriented and then hit the glass. But really it's this light that is incredibly disruptive. And we actually have a pretty poor understanding of why. We kind of take for granted that birds are attracted for light and it's hollow. We don't really understand why that is or what's driving it. But we can see it happening, so it's not hard to imagine how, with all the light pollution in Chicago, that this could be a serious problem. And I know those of you who have been monitoring buildings are quite aware of this. So for a nocturnally migratory bird that's flying through this region, and most of our migratory birds are migrating primarily at night, this lightscape in Chicago is apparently very disorienting and creates a lot of collisions. And so this is something that's been known for a while, but I want to highlight a recent study by a different group that's cut off at the bottom now, but Horton et al., who recently quantified the degree to which migratory birds are exposed to artificial light throughout the United States. And so I'll walk through this. What they did was they looked at all the major metropolitan areas in the United States. They quantified the amount of light that basically is being produced. There we go. Produced by each city, and then also using radar records of the density of bird migration, quantified how many birds are moving through these areas, and then essentially calculated an exposure index for each city, how many migratory birds are being exposed to how much light. And it turns out that Chicago is #1 in the spring and the fall. So that's partly testament to the great migration that takes place here, but also, of course, to the tremendous amount of light. So this isn't exactly a statistic to be proud of, but it does highlight for all of you the importance of the work here in Chicago, because this is, front and center for understanding bird pollution. So, and for making legislation, as Annette was talking about, to help reduce the problem. So if the problem can be mitigated in Chicago, that will be a great step in the right direction for the rest of the country. And of course, this has already been happening for some time. So there's as Annette was talking about, there's a tradition of monitoring collisions and trying to take action to reduce light at night and other mitigation factors. And so Dave at the Field Museum has been monitoring McCormick Place every morning pretty much for the past 40 years, looking for collisions. So if you don't know about his separate effort yet, you'll hear a lot about it tonight. And
I know.
I'm just going to look and in addition to that, as Annette said, CBCM has been at this great effort since 2002, which was one of the first in the country, and not only has light pollution been reduced in Chicago as a result of this, but other cities have followed suit and enacted their own programs.
Think of this as a rolling shit.
There you go.
All right. This is actually just an animation of this PowerPoint. Okay, so also worth pointing out before I get into this that a number of cities do now have monitoring programs, going out looking for birds, hopefully rescuing many of them, but also salvaging the carcasses. But few, if any, cities can actually do what the Field Museum has done here in Chicago with these dead birds, actually put them to scientific use. And that's because it just takes so much time and energy and money, infrastructure, and kind of institutions thinking about this to actually prepare specimens, curate them, find space for them, get volunteers to do a lot of the work, but also have paid staff to do the bulk of it. And this has been happening at the Field Museum to a tremendous degree for a long time. More this sort of preparation of skeletons and skins that come from birds that have collided with buildings is happening at the Field Museum at a scale that's not really happening at most other major museums, in large part due to Dave's work. In fact, in other places there are museums that receive a lot of these birds from lights out and collision monitoring programs, but they really have no choice but to discard the specimens because they just can't do anything else with them right now. Okay, so where I'm going with this is that this is, of course, an unfortunate data set. We all wish that these birds weren't dying, but given that they have, and that we have this record at the Field Museum of these birds, it's very unique, and it's actually kind of an unparalleled data set for learning about bird migration. So at the Field Museum are over 80,000 specimens collected since the late 70s from building collisions, and nearly 40,000 from McCormick Place alone, which is rather remarkable. So the question for this talk is, what can we learn from these data? And so there are more than 200 species represented in these 80,000 birds, 80,000 specimens. Many species over 60 that have large series, so over 100. Several species that have a lot of high numbers, so that's almost 1,400 specimens per species. And this kind of time series, this just doesn't exist really in other places that have 40 years of data like this. So,
They stop loading.
yeah.
You want me to just do?
Manual?
If you don't mind.
Sure.
Somehow it also put me back at the beginning.
Oops. Keep going.
Yep.
Am I going backwards
Keep
or-
going, keep going. Okay. All right, thank you. So I'll just try to,
That's fine.
signal or something.
Oops. Again.
Okay, so I'll talk about two questions. First, from these data, we've actually learned a little bit lately about the question of why do some birds climb with buildings more than others, which turns out to be kind of confounding and more interesting than I had ever imagined. And then secondly, what can these specimens teach us about how birds are evolving, how birds are responding in this area of rapid global change, both in terms of climate and habitat modification. Okay. So for this first question, why do some bird species collide with buildings more than others in advance? We know that, and if you've monitored collisions, you'll recognize a number of these species names. So a disproportionate number of the collisions are made up by a relative handful of species. These are the top 9, so white-throated sparrow, more than 10,000, probably almost 15,000 at this point that have come into the Field Museum. Now, granted, there are a lot of white-throated sparrows in the world. If you've ever gone camping, say, in Canada or northern Michigan, they're everywhere, but this is still seems disproportionate. Juncos, thrushes such as hermit and Swainson's thrush, a couple warblers, brown creeper. So it's easy to get distracted by the massive numbers of these few species in advanced. Thank you. But it turns out that lurking in these data are some interesting patterns of birds that are not being found. So this chart is showing, what I did here is I took the 50 most common birds that are seen by bird watchers in Chicago. Just if you were to go out bird watching in a day here, what were the passerine birds, so things like songbirds, that you would most commonly see, and then how commonly are they found in this collision data set. And it ranges from over 10,000 white-throated sparrows to only 2 warbling vireos. Now, warbling vireo is a very common bird, and 2 of them in 40 years, that's really kind of surprising. It's more than kind of surprising, it's very surprising. Okay. So it turns out that there are several species that you would just imagine ought to be colliding with the buildings alongside all the others, but they're just not. So there are only specimens of 133 red-eyed vireos, which may seem like a lot, but compare that to 10 or 15,000 white-throated sparrows, that's not very many. Flycatchers are very uncommonly found in collisions. Blue-gray gnatcatcher, common bird on the Chicago lakefront, really found very rarely, as well as things like gray catbirds are found sometimes, but not as commonly as they probably ought to be, and wrens. And so this absence of certain species, particularly for me, the red-eyed vireo has really stood out because, I don't know if any of you know this, golden fillet. But yeah, so this book has a lot of great tidbits in it, and one of them is it proclaims that this is the most common bird in eastern deciduous forest, and yet they seem to not be colliding with buildings in these kinds of numbers. And so what we've been wondering is, are there any aspects of these species' ecology, their natural history, or their biology that could explain these patterns? So the thing about this is that all these birds are migrating at night, and we actually know very little about the dynamics of nocturnal migration because, as you might imagine, it's incredibly hard to study. It's happening at night in the darkness. Technologies such as radar can show us when there's a lot of birds in the air, but they can't tell us much about, or if anything, about what species are involved. So there's actually very few clues out there as to what could be going on in the sky among these nocturnally migratory birds that could lead to different patterns of collisions. And before I introduce what the clue is, I want to read this quote that's from a paper in the Auk, which is an ornithological journal from 1906 by Whitmer Stone, who's affiliated with Cape May Bird Observatory. And in this paper, which is called, great title, Some Light on Night Migration, he wrote, "The nearest that we can usually come to observing the flight itself is to stand out in the open on some starlit night and listen to the faint chirps that come floating down from the great vault above. We strain our eyes in an effort to catch a glimpse of the throng that we know must be passing overhead, but all in vain, for the migrants of the night are shielded by the darkness alike from friend and foe." So, other than pointing out that the writing in the Auk has really declined since then, and actually the entire paper was like this. Incredible. So this actually contains a real truism about migration, about nocturnal migration. It is true that the nearest we can usually come to observing this flight is to hear these faint chirps come floating down. So what are these chirps? Thank you. One more. So these are nocturnal flight calls. Now, there are a lot of nocturnal flight calls happening in Chicago. Kind of hard to hear because of noise pollution, but if you happen to be out in a quiet area during migration and listen very carefully, you can hear nocturnally migratory birds making little call notes as they're passing overhead. And so these are spectrograms, so visualizations of the call. They're just very short little buzzes, and Swainson thrush sounds like dripping water. Little zeeps, very hard to hear. But each species, when you visualize a call, has a distinct flight call. Okay. And we know that from previous research by others, that when there is a lot of artificial light around, rates of flight calling increase. So if you go, for example, near a well-lit football stadium at night, it seems to attract the birds, and they're calling a lot at night. This study was done in Ontario. Another study was done recently, talking about media attention with the Tribute in Light monument in New York City, where these great pillars of light, birds were actually flying into them, circling around in the light, but not just circling, they were calling and calling and calling and calling. Okay, so this light was really exciting and eliciting a call response. And so, this is actually a collaborator, Andy Jones, at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and I were thinking about this, and we eventually realized that a potential major determinant of what birds are colliding with buildings or not is which species give flight calls at night. And so it turns out that just very first glance, we realized that the birds that collide a lot, your warblers, sparrows, thrushes, these are also birds that make lots of nocturnal flight calls, and where every species makes a lot of nocturnal flight calls. Whereas the birds that don't, flycatchers, vireos, wrens, gnatcatchers, these birds also are not known to make any flight calls at night when they're flying. So what's going on here? Well, what do flight calls do? So we don't know a lot about them, but they're thought to be a social cue that birds use to essentially help during navigation or finding habitat. After all, if they're flying along at night, it's energetically demanding. Why call if it's not useful, basically? And so there must be some function that helps them find their way. And so we thought, well, maybe these birds are producing flight calls that, when they get caught in the light, the flight calls are actually attracting other members of the same species towards that area and producing kind of a vicious cycle where more and more birds are getting trapped in this light, and then colliding with buildings. And maybe the ones that don't produce the flight calls, so your vireos and your flycatchers, are kind of passing by less affected because they're not kind of pulled in by the siren song of these flight calls. So we use the collision data to test this actually. So the easy part was just tallying up all the records of collisions in Chicago, but the harder part was actually then determining, well, which species are really colliding more frequently than we expect based on the abundance of birds, and which species are rare. And so for this we need to know something about how many birds of each species are in Chicago near these buildings at the same time. So for this we turn to eBird data. So for those of you who are, I'm sure many of you are familiar with eBird, but if you're not, it's a citizen science database managed by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where bird watchers submit their data. This is a checklist with Josh and John and I one day out at lunch at Field Museum. We saw 37 species in 43 minutes. Not too shabby. And less than a species a minute, I guess. Thanks. That is at the top is a summary of how many eBird checklists just like this have been submitted in Cook County, Illinois. And as of yesterday, it was 216,351 checklists, more or less just like this, from people going out and submitting their observations, which together gives a tremendous wealth of information about what birds are found in this area and in what abundance. Okay, thanks. So we basically compared these two data sets, and I won't go into all the analytical details, but what this plot is showing is a comparison of collision data with eBird data. And you don't need to read the text on the left, those are all different names of species, and these